There is a limestone block sitting in the basement storage of the Cairo Museum right now. Not on display, not accessible to the public, not the subject of any dedicated peer-reviewed study since it was catalogued more than 50 years ago. It is labeled JE9289. It measures about 4 feet across, carved on one face with a hieroglyphic register that no Egyptologist has been able to match to anything in the standard dynastic religious canon. And carved into that register, in the precise grammatical structure the ancient Egyptians used to designate specific classes of beings, not poetic flourishes, not decorative text, but formal categorical designations, is a compound glyph that translates, provisionally, as those who came before the counting of years. That is not a myth. That is a limestone block, catalogued, stored, documented, and left unanswered. What it depicts, why it was sealed underground, and why it connects to a site in southeastern Turkey that predates the Egyptian pyramid complex by roughly 7,000 years, that is what we are going to walk through, piece by piece, because the data trail here is longer and more specific than almost anything you have encountered in the conventional story of Egypt. The block was excavated in 1971 from a sealed subsidiary chamber beneath the Saqqara necropolis, the vast ancient burial complex located about 30 kilometers south of modern Cairo. Saqqara is the site of the Step Pyramid of Djoser, widely considered one of the oldest complete stone building complexes known to history, constructed around the 27th century BCE. The excavation that produced JE9289 was led by Jean-Philippe Lauer, a French architect and Egyptologist who, from his arrival at Saqqara in 1926 until his death in 2001, spent 75 years working the site and who was considered the foremost expert on pyramid construction techniques of his generation. His work there was not fringe. It was the foundation of how the academic world understands Saqqara's architecture. Lauer's field notes, held in the archive of the French National Centre for Scientific Research in Paris, described the chamber where the block was found as predating the surrounding step pyramid complex, not by decades, by centuries. The stratigraphic analysis placed the construction of that sealed chamber before the accepted beginning of dynastic Egypt. Lauer documented this. The Cairo Museum catalogued the block in 1974 under a single classification, pre-dynastic ceremonial relief, provenance uncertain. No dedicated iconographic study has been published since. Let that sit for a moment. A man who spent 75 years at one of the most important archaeological sites on Earth, the man whose excavations literally defined what we know about Saqqara's oldest layers, found a sealed underground chamber, pulled out a carved limestone block with hieroglyphs that could not be placed in any known canon, documented that the chamber was older than dynastic Egypt, and the academic response was a catalogue, entry, and silence. The official version says the story of ancient Egypt begins with the first dynasty, around 3100 BCE. The data from Saqqara keeps pointing at something older, and the people who found it either could not explain it or stopped looking. Now look at what is actually carved on JE9289. The register does not show a religious offering scene. It does not show a coronation, a procession, or a funerary, right, the categories that dominate almost every other carved surface at Saqqara. What it shows is a construction sequence, figures directing the placement of large rectangular stone forms, using instruments. One instrument appears repeatedly throughout the carved scene, a rod with a forked terminus, held at a specific downward angle by every figure depicted using it. Researchers who encountered this image in Lauer's documentation for decades classified it as a ceremonial implement, symbolic rather than practical, ritual object rather than tool. That classification required no further investigation. The image was filed, the inquiry stopped, and the instrument was recorded as simply unknown. That assumption rested on a comparison set that was missing one critical data point. And here is where it gets specific. In 2000, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt published a field report in the academic journal Neolithics, documenting his excavations at Göbekli Tepe, a site in southeastern Turkey that at the time was already recognized as the oldest known ritual complex on Earth. Göbekli Tepe predates the Egyptian pyramid complex by at least 7,000 years. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from its earliest enclosures places construction somewhere around 9,500 BCE. The site consists of magnificently carved limestone pillars, some weighing between 10 and 15 tons, arranged in circular enclosures. The pillars are incised with animal reliefs and abstract symbols of considerable complexity, a visual sophistication that by all conventional expectations should not exist at that date in human prehistory. Among those pillars is one that researchers have referred to in the academic literature as the vulture stone, Pillar 43. It is one of the most analyzed objects in early Neolithic archaeology, dense, deliberately composed, layered with animals and abstract forms that researchers have spent decades attempting to decode. Among the abstract elements on Pillar 43, there is a carved figure rendered without a head, and that headless figure holds something, a rod with a forked terminus. Held at a downward angle, Schmidt classified it as an unidentified cultic implement and moved on. There is no published record suggesting Schmidt was ever aware of JE 9289 sitting in the basement of the Cairo Museum. He was not looking for a parallel. He found one anyway. Now get specific about the geometry. In 2017, Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University, whose peer-reviewed work on the geological age of the Sphinx enclosure has been a subject of serious academic debate for more than 3 decades, presented an analysis at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America. Among his observations was a geometric note about the forked implement on Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe. The instrument appears multiple times across the pillar's carved surface. In every instance, it is rendered at a consistent downward angle. Schoch noted that consistency as architecturally significant, as a deliberate geometric choice rather than an artistic accident. What was not included in that presentation, because the comparison had not yet been made in any published forum, was this. The forked implement, carved on JE 9289 in Cairo, appears at the same angle, 2 sites, a separation of approximately 7,000 years and roughly 2,000 kilometers, the same instrument, the same specific angle, no known cultural transmission pathway connecting them. No intermediate examples in the archaeological record between Göbekli Tepe in 9500 BCE and the Saqqara chamber sealed beneath dynastic Egypt. The mainstream explanation for this kind of parallel is worth stating fairly, because it is not nothing. Working archaeologists would point out correctly that iconographic parallels across ancient cultures are common and do not require shared origin. Humans, working with similar materials, under similar physical constraints, will independently arrive at similar tool forms. A forked rod held at a downward angle is simply what certain leveling or digging implements look like. Angular consistency in a carved image could reflect artistic convention or the geometry of the carving surface, rather than a transmitted standard. These are reasonable positions. They account for either one of these data points taken alone, but coincidental parallel development does not typically produce a specific geometric angle reproduced identically at 2 sites separated by 7,000 years and 2,000 kilometers with nothing in between. And then there is the biological evidence, which is where the question stops being purely archaeological. In 2019, a genomics research team published a landmark ancient DNA study in the journal Nature Communications covering genetic material extracted from individuals drawn from pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egyptian burial sites. The study confirmed known migration patterns, identifying Levantine, Sub-Saharan, and North African ancestral components, shifting across time periods in ways consistent with the existing archaeological record. The paper received significant academic and popular attention. Its main findings were widely reported. What was not reported was in the supplementary material, 4 individuals, from a pre-dynastic burial layer at Saqqara, the same complex where JE 9289 was found, carry a Y-chromosome haplogroup variant that did not resolve into any known branch of the human lineage tree as it was mapped at the time of the study. The paper's authors flagged it in a single line. Low confidence call, possible sequencing artifact. No follow-up analysis was conducted. No separate paper was published investigating the anomaly. The 4 individuals remain in the dataset, unresolved. The burial layer those 4 individuals came from sits directly beneath the subsidiary chamber where Lauer's team found the carved block in 1971. Now, the mainstream response to this is also worth stating, and stating completely. Ancient DNA, extracted from degraded samples in hot, dry burial environments, produces noise. Low-confidence haplogroup calls appear regularly in large ancient genomics datasets and are routinely attributed to contamination or sequencing artifact. A 4-individual cluster is not statistically significant. The researchers flagged the anomaly themselves, which is exactly what rigorous science looks like. You note the data point, you note the uncertainty, you do not overclaim. These are fair points, and they account for the genomic data in isolation. They do not account for the fact that the 4 anomalous individuals were buried in the layer directly beneath the chamber containing the unclassifiable carved block, depicting beings labeled with a compound glyph, meaning those who came before the counting of years. Here is where the hieroglyphic language becomes important, because this is not a matter of interpretation, it is a matter of grammar. In the Egyptian hieroglyphic system, compound glyphs of the grammatical construction used on JE 9289 are not poetic. They are not decorative. They are precise categorical designations, the same structural form the Egyptians used to name specific classes of beings, specific cosmic offices, specific formal roles in their religious and administrative universe. When the Egyptians carved a compound glyph of that grammatical type, they were filing a designation. They were labeling a category, not writing a poem, not invoking a metaphor, naming something they considered distinct enough to require a name that had no precedent. The glyph, translated as "those who came before the counting of years," does not appear anywhere in the formal dynastic canon, but the physical description of the beings it labels, the beings depicted in the construction sequence carved on JE 9289, using the forked implement, directing the placement of large stone forms, does appear in 3 separate locations across 2 continents, recorded by civilizations that had no known contact with one another. That is, the convergence, and it has not been formally investigated. Lay the data points side by side. 1. A sealed pre-dynastic chamber at Saqqara, excavated by one of the most credentialed Egyptologists in history, containing a carved block that does not match any known scene in the dynastic religious canon, catalogued, stored, not studied. 2. A carved construction sequence on that block depicts a specific implement, a forked rod, at a specific downward angle. The same instrument, at the same angle, appears on Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe, the oldest ritual complex on Earth, 7,000 years older and 2,000 kilometers away, documented by a researcher who had no knowledge of the Cairo block and was not looking for a connection. 3. In the burial layer, directly beneath that sealed chamber, 4 pre-dynastic individuals carry a Y-chromosome haplogroup variant that the most comprehensive ancient DNA study of Egyptian remains ever conducted could not place on the known human family tree. The anomaly was noted, flagged, and not followed up. 3 independent lines of evidence, architectural, geometric, and genomic, converge on the same physical location, the same stratigraphic layer, at the same site. None of that is speculation. Those are documented data points, sitting in field notes, catalogue entries, academic journal, supplementary tables, and conference presentations. The question is not whether they exist. They do. The question is what you do with the convergence. Here is the inversion that changes how you read all of it. We assume the story of Egypt begins with the first dynasty, with Nama, with Menes, with the unification around 3100 BCE. We place the origin of Egyptian civilization at the start of the dynastic record, and treat everything before it as a prologue, scattered Neolithic communities, proto-writing, gradual accumulation toward the great explosion of the Old Kingdom. But what if the first dynasty was not the beginning? What if it was an inheritance? What if the people who built the step pyramid at Saqqara, who established Memphis as a capital, who created the most sophisticated administrative and religious system in the ancient world, in what appears to historians as an almost inexplicably rapid emergence, what if they built at Saqqara because Saqqara already meant something? Because the ground already held something? Because the chamber they sealed underground was not a place they were beginning from, but a record they were preserving, or concealing, from a layer of the past they knew but could not fully explain. The compound glyph on JE9289 suggests that is exactly what they thought. They did not call the beings on that block gods, not in the sense dynastic religion would later construct. They called them a category, a class, something that preceded the count, something that existed before the record started, and they labeled the beings on that carved block with a precision that implies they knew what they were doing. They were not writing mythology. They were making an administrative distinction between the beings in the register and everything else in their religious universe. Whatever those beings were, the Egyptians who sealed that block underground knew enough about them to name them formally and carefully, to carve them showing a construction sequence, to bury the record beneath the oldest layer of their most important necropolis, and to leave it there. Saqqara is not just a burial ground, it is a site where something existed before the first dynasty, that the first dynasty considered important enough to build on top of. The oldest stone complex on Earth, built at a place whose significance was already ancient when the pharaohs arrived. Now here is what is still sitting there, unresolved, as of the time this was compiled. JE9289 remains in basement storage at the Cairo Museum. No dedicated iconographic paper exists. The genomic anomaly in the 2019 supplementary table has not been the subject of any published follow-up analysis. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at Saqqara by teams from French and Japanese universities identified at least 3 sealed subsurface chambers whose dimensions and depth are inconsistent with any known architectural feature at the site. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities classified those chambers as structurally sensitive, pending further geotechnical assessment. Excavation permits have not been issued. The full radar data has not been released to independent researchers. The assessment has been pending for years, beneath the oldest stone complex on Earth, in chambers that radar confirms are present and that no excavation team has opened. The physical record of who built at Saqqara, who they built for, and what they carved into the stone they sealed underground is still there. The textbooks give you the first dynasty as a beginning. The data at Saqqara keeps pointing underneath it. I am not going to tell you what was sealed in those chambers. I am going to show you that the people whose job it is to answer that question have not opened them, and that JE9289, the block that started this, a block documented by the greatest Egyptologist of the 20th century, with a compound glyph naming a category of being that appears nowhere else in the dynastic canon, that block has been sitting in a basement for more than 50 years without a single published study dedicated to what is carved on it. Those who came before the counting of years, that is what the Egyptians called them. Not gods, not ancestors. A category. The next piece of this goes to the chambers themselves, the sealed architecture below the architecture, the rooms, the radar found, and what engineers who have reviewed the subsurface scan data say about their construction. The geometry of what is buried does not match anything the builders of the step pyramid were known to be capable of. That is the next layer, and it goes deeper than the block.